Welcome, everyone. My name's Steve Payne. I'm the Dean of the Columbus School of Law here at the Catholic University of America. And it's my honor to welcome you to this important summit on the future of U.S. human trafficking policy. Here at the law school, we have a mission statement. And in that mission statement, we say, among other things, that we have a core commitment to the ideals of the dignity of each human person, respect for the inviolability of all human life, justice rooted in the common good, the recognition and protection of human rights as gifts of the Creator, and the care for the poor, the neglected, and the vulnerable. We are honored to close out what I understand is Human Trafficking Awareness Month and acknowledge the 25th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act with this important summit. As a law school, we try to live out those commitments every day in our classrooms, our programs, our centers and institutes, our initiatives, our projects. For example, we have an immigrant and refugee advocacy clinic and an immigration law and policy initiative that work with victims of exploitation, that allow our students to travel to the border over spring break to give assistance to people in need there. We have a Families in the Law clinic, which deals with all forms of domestic violence and other forms of abuse and exploitation, obviously from the aspect of providing them with legal services. Our Bakita Initiative for the Study and Disruption of Modern Slavery, which is the sponsor of today's summit, engages in cutting-edge research and hosts events such as this on issues of human trafficking, led by Professor Mary Graw. So many of our students who have experienced these programs go on to careers in public service and help establish our law school as a leader in public service and public policy development. One of the reasons this is all possible for our law school is because we are part of a larger research university that is dedicated to the same ideals, that is dedicated to the dignity of every human person, and exists to be in service to the church, the nation, and the world. It's my pleasure then to introduce you to the 16th president of the university, the Catholic University of America, Dr. Peter Kilpatrick.
Thank you, Dean Payne, for that introduction. And it's my real pleasure to welcome all of you to this important summit on the global anti-trafficking movement. As Dean Payne mentioned, we are an R1 research university. In fact, we were one of the first two R1 universities in the United States, founded in the late 1800s, whose mission is to be, as Dean Payne said, of service to the church, nation, and the world. And that service means responding to contemporary issues of our time, and with estimates of nearly 50 million people in the world living under conditions of modern slavery, many of them among the most vulnerable in our society, this issue of human trafficking is one that compels all of us to action. I should note here that the issue of human trafficking has been in the forefront of the mind of our church and of our recent Holy Fathers for some time. Pope St. John Paul addressed the very first international conference on 21st century slavery, the human rights dimension to trafficking in human beings, convened in May of 2002. At that conference, Pope St. John Paul condemned human trafficking as a, quote, shocking offense against human dignity and a grave violation of fundamental human rights. Of course, our recent Holy Fathers have enumerated other shocking offenses and grave moral crimes against human dignity, but we'll save those for another conference. In March of 2015, our recent Holy Father, Pope Francis, exhorted the world to more urgent action, stating, quote, "It is not possible to remain indifferent before the knowledge that human beings are bought and sold like goods. Whoever uses human persons in this way and exploits them, even if indirectly, becomes an accomplice of injustice." Here at the Catholic University of America, hosting the summit is just one example of our effort to not remain indifferent to this form of exploitation and suffering in our world. This panel represents what a large research university can do by having its different disciplines combine their efforts to gather together such an esteemed panel of public servants for this important bipartisan conversation. This includes our Global Studies program, our Department of Politics, who together have educated literally thousands of tomorrow's leaders to be well equipped to take on these challenges, as well as our law school and the Bakita Initiative and our new Immigration Law and Policy Initiative, who prepare law students to be leaders in legal responses to such pernicious problems. I want to especially thank Professor Mary Graw, the director of our Bakita Initiative, for her leadership in bringing this conference to fruition. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the example to all the students here of all 5 of these ambassadors. Each and every one of them illustrates a life dedicated to public service. It's a true gift to our students to hear from all of you today. Let me close my welcome with another quote from Pope Francis. In 2024, on the 10th World Day of Prayer and Awareness of Human Trafficking, he told us, if we close our eyes and our ears to human trafficking, if we do nothing, we will be guilty of complicity. Let us not be complicit. I, for one, look forward to all of our eyes and ears being opened further today with this summit. So thank you. And I will now turn over the microphone to third-year law student and the participant in the Human Trafficking Seminar, Alexa Finkelstein, to begin the proceedings. Ms. Finkelstein.
Thank you, President Kilpatrick. My name is Alexa Finkelstein, and I'm a third-year law student here at Catholic University. I currently conduct research for the Bakita Initiative, serve as the president of the Criminal Law Society, and am a former student of CUA Law's Human Trafficking Seminar. I have the pleasure of introducing the panelists for today's discussion. A fuller bio for each panelist is available in your brochures. Starting with Ambassador Mark Lagan, who served under the Bush administration from 2007 to 2009. He is currently the Chief Policy Assistant at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Next, Ambassador Luis de Baca, who served under the Obama administration from 2009 to 2014 and is now a law professor at the University of Michigan. Then we have Ambassador Susan Coppage, who served under both the Obama and Trump administrations from 2015 to 2017. She is now the Executive Director of Georgia Legal Services. Next, Ambassador John Cotton Richmond, who served under the Trump administration from 2018 to 2021, and is now serving as the Chief Impact Officer of Atlas Free and the President of the Libertas Council. Lastly, Ambassador Cindy Dyer, who served under the Biden administration from 2023 to 2025. She now serves as the Chief Program Officer for the McCain Institute. And finally, our own Professor Graw Leary, who directs the Bakita Initiative for the Study and Disruption of Modern-Day Slavery. Thank you all again for joining us today.
Thank you, Alexa. So I just thought I'd give a minute to give you a structure on what we're going to be doing for the next hour and 15 minutes or so. Each ambassador we've asked to give about a 5-minute sort of summary of their reflections on the current state of U.S. policy from human trafficking and the implications of that for the future. Then I'll be asking them some follow-up questions regarding what they have said. And at that time, there are index cards on the end of some of your rows. If some of you have questions, jot them down. And I'll ask you at one point to direct them down to the front of the room where my colleague, Dr. Kuzmana Love, will be there, and she will be going through them, and that will be the mechanism that some of our audience will be able to ask our distinguished panel questions. And then we'll give each ambassador 1 minute to sum up all the great thoughts that they've had after your fabulous questions. And after that, we hope you'll join us in the atrium for further discussion. So without further ado, I would like to start at the far end of the table with Ambassador Mark Lagan. Ambassador Lagan.
Thank you very much, Marianne. You've done a marvelous job with partners here at the university and involving the student body of the law school. I want to do a little bit of looking back in order to look at today and look forward. I worked on as a Senate staffer, Senate Foreign Relations Committee staffer on the original Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It was not my idea. I won't suggest I was a hero, but I was lucky to be part of the process. And I served as ambassador in the last 2 years of the George W. Bush administration. And through those experiences, I saw the value of the ambassadorial status of the head of the trafficking office and reporting to the Secretary of State, something Lou, after me, really got to take advantage of with Secretary Clinton. The level of meetings you get from other countries, your power in a tussle with regional bureaus at the State Department about what the rankings of countries will be in the report, or the vigor of the diplomacy to follow up with the governments depended on it. A decision was made in the Bush era that the office should have the pen on writing the report, as opposed to it originally being drafted by personnel in embassies and then sent to the office. And little known, but the office had a role in its own foreign assistance to try and help countries and help NGOs and help international organizations solve the problem. A number of decisions in this era and under this presidential administration change those assets. And it's really worth thinking hard about it. To have success moving forward, we need to think about the evolution of the field. The coalitions forming the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, they were very focused on sex trafficking. It happened in the period that I was the ambassador that the importance of the larger demographic issue of labor-related trafficking was a focus. Even the revelation that documented guest workers could be and were often human trafficking victims, including the Gulf. We differentiated statistics about victims identified, convictions, and prosecutions between sex and labor trafficking. And for years, we now know that there's an impunity that's much larger for labor trafficking than the more resourced effort of fighting sex trafficking. And we started focusing on business as a partner. And I want to thank Amy O'Neill Richard, who, as one of the founders of the TIP office and as a researcher in the State Department's intelligence wing, really helped identify for the U.S. government the phenomenon emerging of human trafficking in the first place. But I would not have become involved in helping found a global business coalition against human trafficking if not at that inflection point, driven in large part by Amy. And there's an evolution. The U.S. was more and more forthcoming about its own faults, not just its achievements, including itself in the report, and then moving from including itself and making the Justice Department put out its own domestic report at the same time, which I helped influence, to, under Lou, there actually being a grade. And most, I think, striking is a survivor voice becoming part of the collective multi-stakeholder policy that the TIP office is involved in. There are real continuities that have to be protected. Holding the trafficker to account with a heavy emphasis of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the Palermo Protocol on that, but extending what's considered the second P, protection after prosecution. I don't like using the expression of protection of victims. Re-empowerment of survivors is probably more appropriate in human and dignity involved, but really living up to our rhetoric rather than going backwards on what is offered. Lou and I, each in our ways, in our writing or Lou's tenure, were focused on actually someone getting a job after trauma-informed job training, not just housing or physical medical care. Bipartisanship is crucial. It's seen here on this panel. It was seen in the formation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and many of its reauthorizations. It was vital when I was head of the office. I saw it when I was the CEO of Polaris, the co-founder of whom is here, Kat John, and kudos to you, and pretty much through 2024. But I just want to alert, I see above all one risk to progress in the service of human dignity on trafficking, and that is the politics, rhetoric, and policy associated with migration. And I'm going to try and put this in as neutral terms as possible, not to offend. recalling I served in a Republican administration. But the important notion that an undocumented migrant can be a victim of human trafficking, enshrined in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and in the Palermo Protocol of the UN, is under threat. I recall a congressman from Texas, Lamar Smith, who chaired the Immigration Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee, asking a question, would undocumented migrants game the system and seek humanitarian visas for human trafficking, and insisted on a cap. And there is no evidence that there has been rife problems there. But in terms of resources going to other things, like DHS and ICE are doing other things than thinking about human trafficking. How's that for neutral? Law enforcement is focusing on other things with its resources. We have had an evolution from conflation of human trafficking with human smuggling or child abduction to a over-focus on sex trafficking only. I believe we need to look at both types, to now a rhetoric and a policy about migration that makes it very hard to vigorously pursue this issue on a multi-stakeholder basis.
That's your thought.
So not surprisingly, I've been doing this for years. I'm going to build on what Mark has done. I think that, one of the things that we see, hopefully that you're seeing just reflected by the five of us here, obviously John Miller no longer with us, Nancy Ely-Rafel, who is, I guess, the missing chair here, who was the founding ambassador for the office. We've been able to come together at times to weigh in on whether it's some legislative things or otherwise, or especially to support and amplify the good work that each of us is hopefully doing. And maybe to suggest things to each other. And so I think that's one of the things that you're seeing is that what we're trying to live in our post-ambassadorial engagement with this is, I think, hopefully reflective of what we did as ambassadors. And it's reflective of, I think, the both good things about the anti-trafficking movement in the United States over the last 30 years, and the thing that it is probably most at risk, as Mark suggested. This notion of continuity, creativity, and consensus, yes, it's the 3 C's all of a sudden, I think is something that is driven by the same impetus that got us to this 3P paradigm. 3P paradigm thought up by Steve Warnoth, who was at that time at the President's Interagency Council on Women as their legal counsel during the Clinton years at the Clinton White House. And this idea of prevention, protection, and prosecution is and was and continues to be revolutionary. The idea that law enforcement, that members of the security apparatus of any country, much less all of the countries, would look at something in which there was anything co-equal to the state's interest in prosecution is tectonic. And I have to say that as person at the Justice Department, who was the recipient of meetings with Steve Warnoth and others, who would come over and say, hey, we've got this new 3P paradigm, even as a civil rights lawyer, and my supervisors would be like, wait a second, we thought there was 1P and it's called prosecution and we're better than everything else. And so it took, I think, we've seen that with all of us who are lawyers. We've seen ourselves have to get over ourselves. I teach law students these days for a living, and more importantly, I am with law professors all the time. We tend to think that we're pretty important, and we tend to think that the thing that we do defines the field that we are in, as opposed to thinking about the social worker, as opposed to thinking about the diplomat, as opposed to thinking about the affected community that we are purporting to do our work on. And so the 3P approach, I think, basically challenged the state, it challenged governments to say, you're going to have to give up some power. And we know that that's not something that you love. You didn't go into enforcement, you didn't go into law because you woke up saying, I'd love to give up some power today. That's why the C, as far as creativity is concerned. One of the things we've seen with everybody up here is we've got people who are deeply creative. So creative that at JTIP, when I was ambassador, I got a visit from my leadership staff. Allison Friedman was the one who was strong enough to actually say these words to me, and I loved her for it then, and I love her for it now, even though we've lost her to her the end of her cancer journey. Is that she said, "Boss, we're putting you on idea moratorium for 6 weeks because people need to sleep." And they need to see their families. And I think every one of us at some point probably needed to be put on idea moratorium because the things that we tried to accomplish and the things that many of you in this room helped us to accomplish or brought to us to be able to have us help run with it are things that forced us to be that creative. The last thing that I want to say is that we are at a point where that type of consensus is at risk. The ability of people in government to be that creative, to give up power in an administration which right now seems to respect power and only power, to hold in those moments where we think about what is bigger and greater than all of us. Our current Pope chose his name in no small part, and he said this, so I'm not just making it up, in no small part because of Pope Leo XIII, who, after the London dockworkers strike and the work that Cardinal Manning did to actually make sure that the families got fed, that the British Army and police were not beating the dockworkers or deporting them back to Ireland, the Pope ended up issuing an encyclical, Rerum Novarum, which basically said, in the case of labor management problems, that it is the responsibility of the church to take the side of the worker, which makes sense if you're thinking about the crimes that cry out to heaven for vengeance, of which 2 of the 4 are oppression of the poor and defrauding of the worker. And so this idea, whether it is a 1,500-year-old idea as far as crimes that call out to heaven for vengeance, whether it's Pope Leo 120 years ago, or whether it's Pope Leo now, I think we certainly have the moral case for working on slavery and trafficking. To the extent that governments will respond remains to be seen. All you.
Thank you. I want to thank Catholic and Mary for selfishly getting all of us together. You heard Lou is in Michigan, I'm in Georgia, so it's a real treat. And next time I'm going to be in the middle. I will wear my purple dress since I am the only one on the panel who served under a D and an R President and Secretary of State. And I want to thank you all for being here because Mary has moved heaven and earth to get us here, but it wouldn't have an impact if you all weren't here. So thank you so much for coming and for fighting in this field and for studying and for wanting to be in this field. It's just so important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the bipartisan role. We always have seen anti-trafficking efforts as bipartisan. When I was the ambassador, Senator Corker, an R from Tennessee, and Senator Cardin, a D from Maryland, would get together and they would ask foreign officials who were visiting them as the chair and the minority chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They would ask them about their country's efforts as reported in the Trafficking in Persons report. They would pull up the page for the Philippines, if that's who was coming, and they would want to know what you're doing to protect your workers before they migrate overseas. So that was bipartisan. I'm going to stick with Tennessee, even though, as I said, I'm from Georgia. And Senator Blackburn and has crossed the aisle with Senator Ossoff from Georgia to pass the Report Act to protect children online and to have safety measures there. And bless her heart, that's what we say. Senator Gillibrand has been pushing for the Trafficking Survivor Protection Act for years and finally joined from across the aisle last year by Senator Hyde Smith from Mississippi to pass that act. So again, we are used to this being bipartisan. And then we have a new election and a new Secretary of State. Senator Secretary of State Rubio, who I was very thrilled was coming in, because when he had been a senator, he had focused so much on anti-trafficking. He had used it, both labor and sex trafficking. He had always grilled the ambassadors who went before him on this matter. So I was really thrilled. And that interest on his part has not been sustained. And he's got a lot on his plate. So that's understandable. But that's why you need a robust tip office and an ambassador to take some of that weight off of the secretary and to do that work that they can be subject matter experts in. So I still view it as bipartisan, and I'm hopeful, because the people in this room, we have law enforcement, we have students, we have prosecutors, we have people who provide services, and we want all that. And it's our civil society that's present here that must tell the elected officials, we still want anti-trafficking laws like the Trafficking Survivor Protection Act. And we still want those laws funded so that they can be enforced. We still want services for survivors funded. We still want protection and education efforts funded. And that's the role that citizen society has on both sides of the aisle to continue doing that. So I'm hoping that this is a groundswell. I really appreciate being here with my I guess you weren't colleagues. I don't know what we are. Peas in a pod. We're peas in a pod. And I really appreciate being here with everyone. And I'm just so excited about this effort and this emphasis to say, let's get going. It's been 1 year. Let's get going.
It's a real honor to get to be here with these four. I have benefited from their wisdom and their leadership and example and counsel, including while I was at the State Department. So I'm really grateful to each of them. And I'm grateful to Mary for your leadership, and Bakita. No small feat pulling all this together. Really grateful for you. When I think about what are the challenges before a U.S. policy, there are so many. But I'd love to think about two at the outset. So one of the ones that I'm thinking a lot about are the structural changes caused by the reorganization in the last 12 months. When we think about funding concerns, and we've heard a lot about that. We're going to hear more about it. It's top of mind for understandable reasons. Funding priorities change with the seasons, and they're going to change again. There is no set of NGOs that should expect or feel entitled to perpetual and automatic funding forever, particularly in a field where there are so many worthy NGOs out there. We're going to see changes continue to come, but it's the structural changes that really concern me, and that if they're allowed to continue, what might ultimately happen. And so when I think about the current status of ILAB at the Department of Labor, when I think about other trafficking offices at other departments, when I think about where we stand at the Department of Justice, I'm concerned about our ability to have enforcement. We need agents available to go execute search warrants and interview victims. We need specialized units. There perhaps has been no more clearly effective strategy to stop traffickers and care and support survivors than specialized units. And when we do not have those, both for sex trafficking and forced labor, both for adult coercion cases as well as minor cases, the whole movement, I think, suffers. This is particularly true when I look at where the field stands right now. We can pat ourselves on the back about the last 25 years, and in many ways we should. We've gotten a grand consensus, we have bipartisan agreement, but when we look at the numbers, I get really worried. We're down almost 20% in global prosecutions in the last 10 years. We're down 18% in global convictions. We only identified 102,000 victims globally last year with an estimate of 27.6 million. That means we're identifying 0.3% of all the victims we estimate exist, leaving 99.7% of victims completely unhelped, continue to be trapped by the companies or cartels or criminals that are trafficking them, and in many ways unable to get services at all. Meanwhile, traffickers' profits are soaring. The estimate that we have from 2002 from the ILO, the 27.6 number was up 10% from its prior number. I feel like all the numbers are going in the wrong direction. The scope of trafficking is increasing, the enforcement is decreasing, our victim identification is anemic, and our funding has been static up until now and now feels like it's plummeting. And so I feel like there has to be more that we can do. And when I think about the State Department and its future, I'm deeply worried about tucking the standalone office of the Trafficking in Persons Office underneath DRL, which effectively demotes the office. I benefited greatly while I was at the State Department with people seeing that the TIP ambassador had the equivalent rank of an assistant secretary, and it benefited us. We did very well in dispute ranking conversations with regional bureaus, with the deputy, and with the secretary. Not having that really diminishes our ability. And for those who've gone to Congress and testified and talked about concerns about a mushrooming of single issue offices, I feel like they would benefit from a better understanding of the history of these single issue offices. It was the people through their representatives that have called for American values to be at the table, along with our geopolitical interests when making foreign policy decisions. It is those American values of freedom and liberty and life that are the foundation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And so I'm concerned about those structural changes. The second thing I'm concerned about, I think about U.S. policy, really involves all of us. It involves not only government, but also the civil society sector. It's concerns around mission creep or an expanded focus. What I mean by that is human trafficking just naturally, as a subject matter, intersects so many other issues. It intersects immigration, it intersects refugees, technology. We think about supply chains, we think about workers' rights, education, even climate and unions. Like, it intersects so many things. And there are, in fact, entire departments and agencies and other NGO networks that are dedicated to these issues. And so they're important. But I think it's important to know that just because there's a relationship between trafficking and these other issues, take immigration, for instance, the intersection between trafficking and immigration is not coextensive. And it is, I think, error to suggest that immigration enforcement remedies are labeled or relabeled as trafficking initiatives. People in this room have spent years, decades, fighting the notion that human trafficking and human smuggling are distinct concepts, and I think that challenge will continue. But it is equally problematic to suggest that other issues that intersect with trafficking, like vulnerability reduction and generalized poverty alleviation, relabeling those as anti-trafficking initiatives. In a very real way, I think the future of what we're trying to build requires us to focus on those 3 Ps that Lou mentioned: the prosecution, protection, and prevention, that all 3 of those still remain viable, and efforts to delete or diminish any of them should be avoided. We need to focus on victim identification, trauma-informed services, perpetrator accountability, and targeted prevention. And when we get distracted, when we broaden our scope so wide that we go to these other things, we dilute our limited resources, and we cut ourselves off at the knees when it comes to data and metrics that we could actually use from a policy perspective to argue for more expansive funding. And so I think that the good news is that today's status quo will not be the future. For the folks who feel like all is lost, I don't think all is lost. I think that we have the opportunity to forge ahead a new future. And for folks who think, hey, we just need to revert to the past, I would suggest that the past wasn't always perfect. We weren't always listening to survivors. We weren't always focusing on forced labor as well as sex trafficking. I don't think reverting to the past is going to be the goal. It's going to be forging a pathway forward into the future with hope and with vision, and that's going to require focus.
I know I agreed to go last. I would like to retract my agreement. So I'm like, all the things that I'm going to talk about, well, they covered that. You know, well, they covered that too. So you're getting the leftovers with me, y'all. All right. But there are, and my smart friends actually did cover a lot. I'm going to cover a few things that I think are interesting, especially for like people that are not super familiar with how the State Department and the office works, which would be me like 3 or 4 years ago. And so I want to talk about some of the unintended consequences of some of the changes that you guys have all read about and that my smart colleagues have raised. So one of the things to flag is you may have seen that the Trafficking in Persons report did come out. It was late, but it came out. And it was not gutted the way that the Human Rights Report had been. And that is because, number one, the Trafficking in Persons report is highly prescriptive in the legislation. So it's very much like, you will do this, you will measure it by this, it'll come out at this time, all these things must be there. And the Human Rights Report is a little more loosey. But it also happened because of the amazing tenacity and grit of the people in the Trafficking in Persons office. And so y'all think that tall trees are up here. The tall trees are right out here. So when y'all get a break, don't come up here. There are people here that are so smart and so tenacious, and I'm so grateful to them. That's why that report came out, and that's why it was not a shell of its former self. I am worried because since that happened, the staff at the Trafficking in Persons office has been cut by, like, I think it was like from 74 to 30. I mean, it's just crazy, y'all. And on top of that, it had an outsized impact on the reports and political affairs team because that's where the more junior staff were. And, you know, they didn't think about this team versus this team. They just across the board if it's less than this number of people. And that's a hard place to be. That's where you kind of cut your teeth and you travel and you don't see your family. So that's not where the fat cats are, okay? That's where the young folks are that are still learning. And so I am super worried just because we had a good tip report this year, I don't know that we're gonna have one next year because the staff has been gutted. And so that's a worry. That's an unintended consequence. Another unintended consequence, and my smart colleagues mentioned this, is that there was a definitive effort to reduce the power and the stature of the Trafficking in Persons office and of the ambassador position. Why? Because we are problematic. Why? Because we're over there making, you know, I know you want to do this for this country, but have you thought about the fact that all these domestic servants are trapped in jail and they won't let them out? And that's not, but let me talk about warplanes. No. You go talk about, well, I'm talking about women who came to work and when they tried to just go home, you put them in jail. I want to talk about warplanes. And so they did this so to make their job easier. But you know what happened when you weakened the Trafficking in Persons office and when you weakened the ambassador position? You not only weaken our position in the building, right? I can't go in and fight with the bigwigs that are over the regional bureaus, but you also weaken the office's ability to get bad countries, bad governments to do good things. You know, because if you send in an ambassador, it's very hierarchical, into a bilateral meeting, they will give you the foreign minister. They'll give you a bigwig. If you send in a dedicated civil servant, they will give you a dedicated civil servant. And which do you think can make Turkmenistan change their law? It's, you know, that's the facts. And so when you weaken the office within the building, you weaken the office within the world. And another thing, when you weaken the office as it pertains to the world, you weaken the voices of the civil society organizations who rely on that information. When you make them less, when you make that ambassador and that office less strong, you take away what little strength that CSO, that NGO in the Gambia or in the Philippines had, because you weaken that woman too. And it just makes me want to tear my hair out, these unintended consequences, which nobody really thought. I don't think it was intended. I really think they were unintended. And so these are things that really make it frustrating. And then the other thing, and the final, is that when you weaken the office, you weaken the office's ability to support services for survivors. You weaken the office's ability to support prosecution of bad guys. These are the unintended consequences. I think that these are things that can be fixed, but I don't want them to go unnoticed while you're thinking about just the things that are the top line. But I cannot end with that. I'm going to end with the fact that I do have kind of moments of hope here, and that is that all of you are here. So I am at an NGO now and not the government, and I was looking to see who all is going to be in this room. I am so heartened by the fact that in this room, there are clearly progressives and conservatives. There is young, and then there's old. I'm bringing in the old. There's young and old. There are faith-based organizations, and there are secular organizations. There are academics, there are government officials, and there are NGOs. This is an amazing, broad, bipartisan, and diverse group of people, and you all care about something. And so I want to compliment you. In a world where we can't agree on anything, all these people, there's a lot of things y'all don't agree on. I know because I read your emails and stuff. But there's something that you can all agree on, and y'all can sit in here and all be together. And that gives me a little bit of hope, because there are few times and issues that allow for that. And I think that we hopefully embody that. All these people. I also was in 2 administrations. I was in the Bush administration.
Okay. Yes, you can wear purple too.
I will wear purple too. I mean, it's not a competition, but I do want to win. And like all of us, we are in all these, 25 different years in all these different administrations, and we're up here in broad agreement. So if we can all do this, I do have some hope. And so I'm going into that.
Thank you all so very much for those great, insightful comments. I took a lot of notes, and we're only 20 minutes into this. I've got a couple of questions, and I want to encourage the audience, if some questions sparked with you, jot them down on the cards and eventually sort of pass them along to my colleague, Dr. Love, in the pink to my front left, and she will collect them for us for a little bit later. A lot of you touched on this, but I'd like to maybe direct this at you, Susan, and then others can chime in. And this is the lack of an ambassador now. You all commented on the importance of it being an ambassador, that a year has gone by, how the issue is important in the State Department. Could you maybe share with the audience a little bit more about how the absence of an ambassador, and expand if there's anything more to say about the fully staffed TIP office, what that means with regard to developing policy and responding to human trafficking?
Yeah, so I think, we all touched on that a little bit, but you need a leader that champions the cause. If you are in school here at Catholic, whether it's law school or undergrad, let's say law school, because I remember that better. And you go and your professor cares about the law of perpetuities or against perpetuities or whatever that is.
21 days.
You are gonna study that before the final, because they've talked about it, they really like it, so they're probably gonna ask a question about it, right? So you're gonna study that. Well, that's the same thing. When you have an ambassador who can be that megaphone for civil society, for law enforcement, for the policies that we're enacting, people are going to hear that, and they're going to pivot some resources to it. When John came in as the ambassador, he had huge help in the first Trump administration from Ivanka Trump, who took up this issue and championed it from a corner of the White House, from a place of access, which matters in Washington, D.C. I talked about Senator Corker. I came in to a Democratic presidential administration and a Republican Senate as a girl from Georgia with no State Department experience. Nobody was going to listen to me. But Senator Corker used his capital to say, wait, this issue matters. And he would call me and tell me stuff that I then had to report to people higher than me at the State Department. And they realized I was talking to this person who held the purse strings. So all of a sudden it elevated the issue. Right? These are just little 2 examples. But who elevates the issue now? Who speaks up? Who is the champion? We need that. And again, the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act was really important, and Senator Gillibrand has been beating that drum for years. But it's a great step. And as a prosecutor, those of us who we saw trafficking victims commit crimes of migration, identity theft, drug use, a whole bunch of crimes that are addressed by that. But we also saw survivors who booked hotel rooms, posted online, watched and recruited other victims into the scheme. Those crimes are not protected by that act. So it's a step, and we should be very proud of that accomplishment. But again, you need a leader to say, wait, there's some things still missing. And I'm looking at Andrea Powell because she brought me a survivor who had been wrongly prosecuted in Georgia because John sent her my way because he didn't want to come into Georgia.
I'm not barred. I don't have a law license.
And she had been a 17-year-old trafficking victim under federal or state law, and she'd been prosecuted because when her friend called her and wanted to run away, the trafficker said, yeah, we'll come pick you up. And so she was prosecuted for that. And we have vacature and expungement laws now in Georgia. So 10 years after she was locked up, we were able to go and revisit that. And that can now happen in the federal system. But the federal laws were way behind the states. And the federal government had always been the leader in this area. Again, leadership matters, using your voice matters. But the states had really taken up the vacature and expungement. But again, from a lawyer's perspective, why are we spending time and resources, much less traumatizing victims further, and then vacating a conviction? Wait, that's backwards. Why are we going through all that to say, oh, you shouldn't have been convicted? We should back it up in the course of things and look at, you shouldn't be charged. And if you are charged, you should have an affirmative defense. And you should be able to present that, as we do with all affirmative defenses under the law, to a fact finder, be that a judge or a jury. But again, these are causes that need a leader and someone to speak up for them. And so I just feel like not having that leadership, as Cindy said, not having the foreign government that you visit send someone of equal rank that can say, let's change the laws. I mean, right before I traveled to Qatar, they changed their kafala system and said, okay, you can leave the country without our permission. And they did that because the ambassador for that office was coming, not because Susan Koppich was coming. That would have been nice. But because the ambassador, and we don't have an ambassador. And that's something I think we desperately need.
Thank you. And John, why don't we bring you into this conversation as well? I think you had something to say about this issue.
Well, a couple of thoughts, and I'm aligned with what Susan just said, but I will say we're really happy that the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act has passed. We're glad that the president's indicated he's going to sign it. Vacatur and expungement really matter. It was fun to introduce Andrea to Susan over email in Tiffany's case, and we're glad that she's I'll also say we're thrilled that last week, Holly Nadal, who was one of the key advocates in pushing forward the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, got a full and unconditional pardon from the President of the United States, which is making wrong things right, particularly having attended her sentencing hearing in federal court here in D.C., where I left happy that I wasn't held in contempt as I watched them sentence her while saying she was a victim. It was unbelievable. So we're glad that she's out. I will say that not having an ambassador is really challenging for all the reasons that Cindy mentioned in terms of parity on the international stage as well as within the building that Susan was talking about. I will also say we've done this before. Perhaps the best person to answer this question is Amy, because she's had to work in the office when there haven't been ambassadors. But it was a long period of time between Susan and me. We're not only 1 year into this administration. It was a year and a half, I think, before Cindy was even sent to the Senate. We've had long periods without ambassadors, reports that have had to be issued without a principal in the office, and it makes it hard for all those reasons. And so we're not in new territory, but we're in territory that's unnecessarily difficult. All we need to do is appoint someone and give them the rank.
Ambassador DeBaca, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's interesting, and this goes to some of the institutional concerns that you've been hearing from us, is that during the time periods when we had an acting, the principal deputy becoming the acting director of the office. They're not the acting ambassador, they're the acting director of the office. But they were the acting director of an office that was statutorily set up so that the head of the office was an assistant secretary equivalent. Now, so what does that mean? Remember, the trafficking office, sometimes much to the chagrin of our agency partners, doesn't just have responsibilities for foreign affairs. It also basically, and this is unique for most issues in the federal government, it also ends up being the secretariat for the interagency process, which normally is going to be done by the Domestic Policy Council or the National Security Council. And instead, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act says JTIP does that. Really what it's saying is the ambassador does that. It's a very unique position, and it's a position that only works because the ambassador is at that level. If the ambassador suddenly is a high-ranking political appointee who is a functionary of the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Rights, and Labor. Then when you go over to talk to an assistant secretary level position over at DOJ or at DHS or HHS or Ed or Transportation. So we would get people from other agencies who would learn about trafficking, become phenomenally committed to fighting trafficking, and were not necessarily understanding what trafficking was. And they needed to gently be brought into what the United States government's anti-trafficking work was before they had that press conference or what have you. That only really works if they see you as a Senate-confirmed person who speaks for the president as an ambassador, and almost only an ambassador can in the U.S. government. And if they see you that way, then you are able to come, reposition, bring them back in, have it so that what they do ends up being value added. Or frankly, if you need to go stop them from doing something, you have the power to do that. So this idea, it's not simply, oh, it's nice to be able to say that our pinstripe suits are a little shinier, or that we get to have this title for the rest of our lives, which is pretty cool. It's the fact that we speak for the American people and we speak for the president in a way that allows us to project this issue out into the world, but also across the U.S. government in a very unique way. If we lose that for this issue, that's a tragedy.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. I'd like to switch gears a little bit to another point that sort of ran as a theme throughout your comments, and that's civil society. And I'd like to start with Ambassador Lagon. Ambassador, while you were at state and since then you've been heavily involved with civil society, could you expound on the importance of those groups in advancing what the Trafficking in Persons Office tries to do?
Essential from when I've gotten to work with NGOs in government and since, but also I was CEO of Polaris for a time and CEO of Freedom House, and I've seen the relationship that happens with governments. At Polaris, I saw the formation of an alliance of different organizations, the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, and when they were aligned, nudged by a funder to not compete, but to have a multiplier effect of advocating together, that really mattered. A civil society organization can be both a valuable partner to government and a helpful critic at the same time. And people have a tendency to think that that's mutually exclusive. It may be harder, as of 2025, but because there's a devaluing of NGOs and even a hostility, and you see an alignment between some voices in the United States and governments abroad. But it really was striking to me as head of the TIP office at state, going to major democracies, Mexico, India, Japan, and a hostility of the governments to civil society. They did not see them as important partners in finding human trafficking survivors or in serving them or delivering justice for them, saw them as untrustworthy, carping critics, and at worst sort of funding seekers. In particular, trust and cooperation between law enforcement and immigration officials on the one side and NGOs on the other is essential. I saw that in a task force in Chicago where DOJ, FBI, state and local law enforcement, a sheriff who Central Casting gave the name Tom Dart, as he insisted that you hold Johns to account as much as you do women in prostitution or girls in prostitution, and he found the way to get them was to impound their car because their partner had to find out why their car was impounded. But social services and NGOs and faith-based organizations like Salvation Army were essential to that cooperation, and I think we need that. NGOs not just as advocates and moral voices, but implementers, effective implementers. I actually think they're more effective implementers than Beltway bandit contractors. But, and in countries, particularly survivor organizations, if this movement, and what Cindy describes is a movement, is about abolition of a form of slavery, we aren't going to drive forward on that if civil society isn't integral.
Thank you. And I want to bring into the conversation Ambassador McCain, because you are, of course, running an NGO. So maybe if you could expound upon that. And then I'd also like to follow up. You touched on it, and during your time, there was a real elevation of the voices of survivors. And as we've heard, perhaps today those voices are not being acknowledged as much. So maybe if you could expound on what you see happening in that space.
Thank you. And I do. It's interesting. A lot of us have talked about the concern about the lack of bipartisan leadership on this issue. And I think we saw that when all these cuts were happening to the Trafficking in Persons Office. Nobody from Congress was really running around screaming. And I think that there was a time when people would have been. And nobody was doing it. And I'm really worried about the lack of bipartisan support. And so that's one of the main reasons that when I left government, I went to the McCain Institute, because I feel like there's no better example of somebody that can absolutely stick to their principles. This man stayed in a POW camp for 5.5 years because he would not leave until everybody else left. And yet he could reach across the aisle and be good friends with and good collaborators with Joe Biden, Joe Lieberman, and Ted Kennedy. That's what we're needing. We need people. You know, and I am a little bit worried because, like, right now in the climate that we live in, I feel like compromise is seen as weakness. And I feel like, you know, finding common ground is seen as abdicating your values. And that is not a winning strategy. I feel like we need people who can say, we don't agree on everything, and that's okay, but we can agree on this thing. And so I really went to McCain for that very reason. And I think that an important element is, as you brought up, survivors. We've got to maintain to make sure that everything that we're doing is what's in the best interest of survivors. And I've told others on here some of my greatest happiest moments when we were really being able to utilize the survivors that were part of the President's Interagency Council, you know, the Survivors Council. We not only, when I was in the office and with the great support of the office, even before I got there, we brought survivors to like multilateral events. We brought survivors to the OSCE and to the OAS, and I shared my chair with them. We had survivors sit behind the flag, and I shared, if I got 2 minutes, my survivor advocate and leader got 1 minute at least. And so put your money where your mouth is. And I was really happy about that. I was super, super sad that I was not able to create a position in the front office focused on making sure that we were weaving survivor lens and survivor leadership throughout everything that we did. But I'm still hopeful for that. But that is definitely one of the things that I'm most upset about. But I also, again, I can't end on a terrible note. There are areas where I'm seeing some bipartisan support. I think that the online scam operations has brought together some bipartisan. There is a bill that there is truly a bipartisan caucus. It's in the House. And so I'm hopeful that if we can just find more of those things and move the ball forward, and maybe the first time it's not going to be perfect, but as we saw, like I came into this work through the gender-based violence movement. I was a specialized domestic violence prosecutor before the Violence Against Women's Act passed and after. And we didn't all think that the Violence Against Women Act was perfect when it passed, but we kept going at it and chipping away and re-auth and re-auth. We didn't say in 1994, it's not perfect, so I won't agree. You're like, it's not perfect, I'm gonna take what I can get. And then we came back to get more. And I think that kind of having a little bit of a spirit of let's get what we can where we can agree and then come back at it and come back at it.
Thank you. Thank you. There's one other topic that we haven't really touched on. So Ambassador Cotton Richmond, I'd like to direct this to you, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to the audience. And I see my colleague has a handful of questions. And that has to do with Customs and Border Patrol. As you know, as you have been very vocal about, they have the task of enforcing the ban on products that are made with forced labor. And we've seen a change predating this current administration in the enforcement of that. And I wonder if you could share your thoughts on that.
I appreciate you raising the Tariff Act, which is something that I care deeply about. You know, when I think as Mark was saying, when under John Miller's tenure, I remember actually coming to him when I was living in India, talking to him about forced labor cases that I had been working. But it really wasn't until under Mark's tenure and with leaders in this room that the issue of forced labor, I think, really began to take center stage. In 2016, we saw Customs sort of dust off the old 1930 Hoots-Smalley Tariff Act, which bars the importation of goods where traffickers have used people and forced them to work. So goods made in whole or part by forced labor victims can't come into the United States. They can be seized. And we hadn't done anything with that act since 1999 was when the last withhold release order was issued. We had a flurry of them in the 90s, kind of a trade war with China. Almost all of them were against China. And then it was crickets until 2016. And if you're interested in why, there's this 2015 TVPA and the consumptive demand exception. I won't bore you with it. But we began to see a massive increase in the number of withhold release orders. Up to 2020 was our high watermark with 14 that were issued in that year. And I remember specifically working with DHS and others to fight to actually get a withhold release order on rubber gloves coming in from Malaysia, while people at high levels of government were saying, no, we need them because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what they were saying is, we care more about a virus we might get than whether these gloves were made by victims we know were trafficked. We saw the same thing with solar panels and other things where people are basically saying, you know, renewable energies are great, there are multiple noble priorities, but the question, are we going to go green on the back of exploitation? Are we going to trade the marginal potential benefit that could come from solar panels with the guaranteed suffering of Uyghurs in China? And we've had leaders in our country who have said, that's not my issue. I'm just going to focus on the environmental piece. But I think we've got to deal with where noble issues get tangled up and where we have multiple noble priorities that compete with one another for our attention, and we have to lead through those. The withhold release orders basically say you can't bring them in. And then we had a huge effort at the State Department to declare what was happening in Xinjiang, China, to the Uyghur Muslim minority a genocide. And finally, at the very end of the Trump administration, part one, we had a declaration of genocide, which was great. We didn't quite get that obstructionist community at the State Department to agree that it was because of forced labor, although the facts supported it, but we were able to at least get the genocide declaration. 6 weeks later, Secretary Blinken also issued a genocide declaration. These two guys may not agree grass is green, but they agreed what was happening in Xinjiang was wrong. The unanimous passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which really flipped the script and said, we're going to create a presumption that everything coming in from Xinjiang or made by Uyghurs is forced labor. We're to the burden on companies to prove that it's not. So we have a presumption of forced labor and that all those things should be blocked, and we cheered. What we found was there was incredible bipartisan soaring rhetoric around the enactment of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And since then, we have found bipartisan anemic implementation of that act. Our high watermark was 2024, where we saw 1.7 billion in goods seized. But then in March of 2024, we saw a massive drop-off. As we headed into that summer, in June was slow, and then it was a trickle of just a few $1 million worth of goods seized a year, and it's been flat ever since. So we've had bipartisan concern about whether we're going to implement that at all. And the question is whether U.S. consumers are going to be unwittingly participating and benefiting from forced labor ventures because those products reach our shelves. And so one way we want to fight forced labor, this is one way. We're seeing Europe with a forced labor ban. We're seeing due diligence laws being watered down in the EU. I think we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to actually kind of put a true effort in and a priority around this? I think one of the concerns that I think we have on these is that vision without implementation is actually harmful. It sets up a permission structure and it creates this expectation of toxic normality. Ask any parent of a toddler, rules that are not enforced invites future impunity, right? We know this. When we have forced labor bans that governments do not effectively, transparently, and consistently enforce, we're creating a system in which traffickers are not worried. They're not concerned at all about forcing people to work and shipping those goods into the United States. And so I think what we have to see is a massive resourcing of DHS. This isn't a criticism of the Office of Trade at DHS in a real way. They need more top cover. They need more energy. They need more resources and training to actually maximize and push forward the good work that the legislature has done. And without legislative leadership and executive leadership on the issue around the Tariff Act, I think we're going to continue to struggle.
Thank you. I see our two ambassadors at the end want to speak, and I know we've got a lot of audience questions. So can I give Ambassador DeBaca you 1 minute? Can I do that?
I will.
You can give him one.
I will use judiciously many minutes. I think one of the problems that we see right now that I think we have to address, and it's not necessarily coming out of the work that's being done by the Tariff Act folks, but we have a massive repositioning of agent resources at DHS over the last 5 to 6 months, especially with these surges that are being directed and carried out by an agency that is historically not able to do anything more than 100 miles from the border, who somehow is now transcendent over what had been created out of a combination of customs agents and INS immigration agents by the Homeland Security Act back in 2002. Those immigration agents back then, there was two groups of them as well. The folks from enforcement and removal operations who go and get people who have a final order of deportation and get them out of the country, and the people who investigated cases. That grew into something that we call HSI, which is the Homeland Security Investigations. For a whole host of reasons, over the last 25 years, the FBI has given away a lot of its power to investigate trafficking in persons and slavery cases to HSI. Not going to debate why or exactly what's happened, but by having all our eggs in that basket, both for Tariff Act enforcement and for investigating and prosecuting kind of normal everyday slavery cases that our predecessors from 100 years would recognize as a slavery case, by putting that into a place that is now decimated by sending people up to Minneapolis to chase 6-year-olds, is doing tremendous harm to our fight against slavery and trafficking.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Love, if you're ready, you've got a big stack of cards there, and we want to hear from all of you. So, Dr. Love, do you want to share some of the sample questions?
Sure. I'll start it off, and then I'll ask the students to come over to read the questions. The first is a couple of questions that are all on part of the private sector. One is, what role should the private sector play? And where are the opportunities to engage both business investment communities in the fight against human trafficking? Related, is there an opportunity to enforce anti-human trafficking laws through better education and proxy voting? And how can you convince businesses and leverage DEOs to serve as champions for anti-human trafficking? So free clustered around the private sector work.
Private sector, does anyone want to take a stab? Ambassador Legal.
with the private sector, you need a good cop, bad cop approach. You need those NGOs and those instruments of government like what John was talking about on forced labor, tainted goods. And then you need those who work with business. And, I think it's healthy to have NGOs that are in both each mode, and there need to be people in doing that. I'll just focus on supply chains. Over the time from when I served in the tip office to now, there have been changes in norms where it used to be that companies would devolve responsibility for looking for human trafficking, child labor, forced labor in the supply chains to those lower down in the supply chain. The supplier agreements, kind of wash their hands of it. Well, if it's found down below, that's their problem. And I think if you can set up a dynamic of a healthy competition between businesses, and that's why I like the original California supply chain accountability legislation. If you ask businesses to publicly report what they're doing to look into their supply chains, not just prescribing exactly what they have to do, then perhaps if they are transparent about real actions, their competitors will feel they have to do the same.
Did you want to say? Yeah, I mean, it's also, you don't want, as an American business, to have to compete against an entity that has got cheaper labor because they're exploiting their workers. So business is a natural ally there to say, we want our goods made not only in America, but we want them made slave-free. And so I think there's a relationship there that brings business in as a very willing partner to hold up human rights so that the playing field for the business is even.
Great. Thank you. Great point. Dr. Love, do you have an additional question or?
The second question is, what cities/states have been doing a good job on fighting human trafficking around here? Who's the blueprint on a local scale?
Can you say that more slowly? We're a little old up here. Well, I speak only for myself.
What cities and states have been doing a good job on fighting human trafficking around here? Who's the blueprint on a local scale?
Okay. What cities and states have been good in the human trafficking space? And what's a blueprint on the local scale? Thank you.
Georgia does a great job. No, they actually do. And again, I am like a broken record. The example is the governor's office and the first lady, they set up a commission and it's got businesses on it and it's got nonprofits on it and it looks at the laws. And the first lady's office is the one that pushed the vacatur law that we have now. Again, leadership matters. Hello, Congress, which way am I yelling? Like leadership, that way?
I think so.
Okay, leadership matters. We need a leader to stand up and just have that megaphone, whether it's the ambassador or an elected senator or representative. So I will say there are good things. Again, every state can do more. I think Shared Hope issues a great report card on the various states on issues that matter. And so I would encourage you to look there and see if there's a particular state that's lagging behind where you have contacts and connections and can make a difference. Blueprint's hard because when you got 50 states, you got 50 ways of doing things. But the Shared Hope looks at the issue and then grades what the states are doing. So I would commend that to your attention.
Thank you. Go ahead. Okay.
I was just going to mention that as is often the case, California sometimes has some of the most progressive, and they do tend to be a bellwether state. And so if you're looking for somebody, a state that's really out there pushing the envelope, I think California is a good one. And that's often, even within the human trafficking movement, recently when Lou connected us, I remember we were talking about sometimes it's helpful to support what California is doing because as California goes, so goes the country. And so that's another one. And I'll also just say that, but every state, even those that are not as progressive, my home state of Texas is not known as a beacon of progressivism. But I think one thing that a lot of the states are doing is developing in their own counties specialized human trafficking services and also specialized human trafficking prosecutors, because the U.S. Attorney's offices, they can't take every single possible case, especially when there aren't pretty big cases. And so I think we're going to need to turn to our state and locals. All the people that used to work with me at the tip office are rolling. They're like, oh, Lord, she found a way to bring it back to the states. But I do think that if we want to see sort of mass prosecution, and I think that even like Dallas County, not progressive, they have a specialized human trafficking prosecutor, and they're aggressively going after cases that probably would not be taken at the U.S. Attorney's Office. They are prosecuting cases where the victims have said, I want you to go after him, but I'm not going to come down, and they go to trial without the victim testifying. And so I do think that sometimes they can be good and scrappy.
Thank you. Teddy, did you have sorry.
So we've had the private sector, we've got state and local. We have 2 questions now on civil society, and then we can. Yeah.
Who's next? This next question is, which of the other American political organizations, NGOs, and international partners have been most collaborative with you all in coordinating efforts to combat human trafficking?
And then as well, if any of you are able to say a few words about the role of religious actors and organizations in your work and how the government can work with and in cooperation with religious actors in the field, how their work can be improved.
From the multilateral position, I think one of the most helpful organizations I engaged with was the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, based out of Vienna. Incredible group of experts, really thoughtful, really engaged all over the world. They care deeply about this issue. And so I very much appreciated engaging with them from a multilateral standpoint. In terms of faith communities, I think they perhaps get far less attention in forums like this, particularly in Washington, D.C., but truly, I think that faith-based nonprofits and communities of faith have done incredible work caring for survivors on the day in, day out, all over the world. Unceremoniously, without a whole lot of fanfare, doing the hard work, whether it's Talitha Kum, whether it is other NGOs around the world. I think there's a lot that can be learned from them. And they often don't show up at anti-trafficking groups because they don't actually perceive themselves as anti-trafficking organizations as much as they just want to do good work as an expression of their faith. And so I think it's wise for us to listen to and engage them.
I think that nobody will be surprised who knows me that I would have to say that it is the not so secret weapon of not just the anti-trafficking movement, but the immigrant rights movement in the United States is the nuns. And you can't do it without the nuns. And that's been the case, I think, pretty much forever as far as why many of these different orders were founded in the first place as far as the work that they end up doing. And so this idea of, what I have to get used to sometimes when I go to conferences, when people say women religious as their label for that, I tend to think of it more like the cavalry coming over the hill. Here come the nuns.
Thank you. Teddy, we have one last question from the audience, and then everyone can have 45 seconds to wrap up.
All right. The closer. What is on top of your list as a creative initiative for the path going forward? Perhaps an initiative that is not reverting to the past.
Anyone want to take a stab at that first?
I'm going to mention something that I collaborated on with the folks at the Trafficking Persons Office when I was there, because I really like it. And for the longest time, the program that probably got some of the most attention that the Trafficking Persons Office did was the Child Protection Compact. And this was really helpful because it gave more money over a longer period of time, and it really allowed the experts at the TIF office to work closely with a country to slowly but methodically change their laws. And it was seen as sort of a best case, a best practice, and we always held it up that way. And when I came in, I was always frustrated that, like, so many times victims, it's like they go to bed at their 17th birthday and they wake up and nobody cares about them anymore. And somehow they went to bed at 17 and we saw them as a victim, and they woke up the next morning and their situation had not changed one bit. And today they are a defendant and they're a criminal and they're an illegal immigrant and they're all these things. And all this kid did was go to bed. And so I've often felt like folks that are adults are simply former victims of child trafficking that we failed to react to and help. And so the office created a new program that's based on the Child Protection Compact, where they do all that extra stuff, but it's available even no matter what the age. And so, and I think that's so important. We don't stop caring just because someone turns 18. And so I think that's a good model, looking at some of the things that have really worked and thinking, okay, if it worked for this population, maybe I can make it work for another one. And so I would hold that one up as a good example.
Thank you, Ambassador Richmond, and then we'll go to closings, and we'll start with you, if that's okay, since you had to go to end at the last.
You know, in terms of creative new initiatives, one of the things I continue to see is leaders around the world, members of parliament, even members of Congress. We start talking about this and they're like, I care, I want to do something, I agree that this is wrong. And they look a little shell-shocked like, what do we do? They're not subject matter folks. They didn't grow up in this space. You know, we're really fortunate that all five of us had done work in this area beforehand. One thing I'm looking for the next trafficking ambassador is that they also come from the field and that they have some practical experience working on this. But we've been coming alongside members of parliament, coming alongside folks in the House, diplomats, and helping kind of take their agreement with these ideas and translate it into actual practical action, helping come up with some solutions that they could drive where you could actually see some change. I think we have failed systems right now that are not delivering the protections of law. We've got great sentences on paper. We've got great resolutions from the UN. We probably don't need another one. What we need is actually use the words we already have and deliver those to the people they're intended to protect. And the problem we have is that we have leaders who agree but don't know how to act. And so we love to come alongside them, give them a plan, give them a strategy, help them figure out how they can actually go from point A to point B.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we've heard so much, and I would love to go on for hours, but many of our students have a 2 o'clock class, and well, I let my students come late. Okay, I don't. I can't do that to my colleagues. So if it's all right with you, Ambassador Dyer, we'll start with you, and just 45 seconds down. Anything, closing thoughts?
Well, first of all, actually, y'all coming today has improved my day. I got up and I'm like, oh, it's going to be tough. But seeing all of you, all in agreement, all from your diverse walks of life, it's actually really inspiring. So thank you so much for being here when you had other things. We didn't even serve pizza and y'all came. So you guys have made it really helpful for us. Keep at it. I think one of the best ways to get that bipartisan leadership back is not just from us here in DC, but for the local NGOs who often have really good relationships with their representatives and senators. Let's use those NGOs to kind of win them over, and we'll get them from the top here in DC and they'll come up from the bottom. And I'm just so hopeful, and y'all have made it so. So thanks.
I think there is a lot of reason for hope in this space and at this time. I said at the beginning, I don't think all is lost. I think we have a chance to build and forge ahead into the future. And I think it's going to be you all and other folks that aren't here today but care deeply about this issue. The victims that are out there, those 99% that are not being identified, they are worth our effort. They are worthy of human dignity. And if we can keep them centered in our minds, I think we're going to maintain the motivation to overcome whatever the ups and downs in policy that might occur.
Amy, will you take a picture of all of us since you're up front? Thank you. I'm so honored to be here with my colleagues because we don't get together very much. And this is, as you've seen, a brilliant group, not commenting on myself, but on the others. I'm gonna stick with the same drum I've been beating. The initiative going forward that I want us to put emphasis on is the non-punishment principle. There is no reason that we can see someone as a trafficking victim who is compelled to engage in forced labor or sexual activity, but when their trafficker says, go rob that convenience store with a gun, that's something they chose to do on their own. It's not. So I really just want to stress that going forward, that needs a lot of our attention still, because survivors with criminal convictions are affected for the rest of their lives. They can't get jobs, they can't get housing, they can't chaperone their children's field trips. I read an article about that in 2016. It's 2026. So I just want to continue to highlight that issue, which is so important to the survivor community. Thanks.
So I want to urge everyone vigilance. This only fails if we collectively take our eye off the ball. 2 weeks after the end of the Civil War, the American Anti-Slavery Association had a meeting in which they were going to vote as to whether or not they should disband because they had won. And Frederick Douglass put the end to that pretty quickly when he stood up and he said, and I will quote him, "Even if the Negro is emancipated, while the slaveholders retain in their hands the power to exclude him from political rights, they can reduce him to a condition similar to slavery. They will not call it slavery, but some other name. Slavery has been fruitful in giving itself names. It has called itself the peculiar institution, the social system, and the impediment. It has been called a great many names, and it will call itself by yet another name, and you and I and all of us had better wait and see what new form this old monster will assume, in what new skin this snake will come forth again. When it does, we'll be ready."
Having co-edited a book on human dignity in global institutions, it's tempting to make a moral statement, but I just want to say, to speak the language of this era, it is not only good for business to fight human trafficking, as Susan put it, it's good for business to be slave-free, but it's good for America. An unintended consequence of the human trafficking cause, and one at the same time on which I work at my current NGO, fighting HIV around the world, is that countries have looked at the United States and they wonder, why is the United States spending so much time on this? Of course, it's annoying to other governments in their face, but it's the insistence on implementation of the agency and recognition of all human beings being of equal value that results of HIV/AIDS, but very importantly, that insistence on not just a law being passed, but if it doesn't get implemented, you might go down in the trafficking report. I used to call this the loop. Go up for having a law, down when it doesn't get implemented. And so I urge you to think about and speak in this era where people seem to think, or some people think, ideals and interests are mutually exclusive, that it's good for America.
Wow, thank you all very much. That was really a great way to summarize things, and nothing puts a damper on it than a couple housekeeping matters, but that is my job. So we're up against our time, but I did want to, before we thank the ambassadors formally, thank a couple other folks who made this happen. Of course, I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Love from the Department of Politics, the Global Study Department, and Associate Dean Julia Young, and our Immigration Law and Policy Initiative with Professor Stacy Bruston. They are all tremendous partners in this event. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't thank the two most important people that make this happen, and those are our fabulous staff members, Joe Ferraro from our Media Communications Office and Renee Stack from our Office of Student Life, who literally made this happen. And you made this happen. The fact this room is full by so many subject matter experts and by so many students not only conveys the importance of this issue, but it demonstrates to our students the rich life of service. And as a professor, I'm deeply grateful to all of you. Many events this month look at human trafficking awareness. Many events this past year looked backward. We wanted this event to look forward, and I think that our ambassadors did a tremendous job of having us think about the future. So I'm going to ask all of you to please join me in thanking them for their great work.